Then you go off to college, now an older adolescent, and he matriculated in the class of 1971 at Radcliffe of Harvard University. And that class was known as the worst class ever, described by the president of the university, I recall. So you were in the worst class ever?
I was in the worst class ever. we thought we were the revolutionaries of all time. I mean, it was the late 1960s. It was the Vietnam War. We were very consumed with politics. When I talk to students today who are in college, they are also extremely interested in politics. And they seem to be more directed and more focused towards what they're going to do after college in terms of graduate school or careers. We were so consumed with the fact that there was the war and other things that we were not quite as focused and directed at the time. But it was a very, very stimulating time. Again, both academically. I was a philosophy and government major, and I was involved in some social services and some volunteer work, but I was also very engaged in sort of the political issues of the time, of the day.
So there was a strike at Harvard, as I recall from reading, and you can imagine who was right involved there in the middle of this strike. And then there was this meeting where you did that leaflet.
The Harvard strike was after there had been a student strike at Columbia University, and the strike on the Harvard campus was triggered by some student activity to try to not have ROTC recruiting on campus anymore. And I would say that I was not in the very center of the strike activities, but I had gone to some SDS, Students for Democratic Society meetings, and I had, participated in lots of Vietnam War events, marches.
Anti-Vietnam
War events, yes. Events in opposition to the Vietnam War, gathering signatures on petitions and participating in demonstrations and so on. When this strike occurred, one of my very best friends was actually in the University Hall where the students had occupied University Hall, and the riot police were called in and yanked the students out of University Hall and took them to the police station, and I went and picked up my friend at the police station who had been slightly injured in the fracas. And she and another student and I knew there was going to be this big meeting in the football stadium in connection with the strike. And we just felt that the various official organizations were not quite expressing our views as carefully as or as clearly as we wanted them expressed. So the three of us drafted our own leaflet, one page, which we persuaded a secretary in one of the residence halls to let us mimeograph. That tells you how old I am. Mimeograph, and hundreds and hundreds of copies of this leaflet, which we handed out at the strike. And when I told my parents about it on the telephone afterwards, my father, they were also not, they were opposed to the Vietnam War, so they were sympathetic in that sense. But my father said, "You better be careful, dear. You might end up with an FBI file."
So I could see her so easily doing this. I'm sure the rest of you can as well. That's not the first time, though, that you've bucked administration. Even as a high school student at Milton, I learned something about her today. That was going to church. You didn't want to go to church?
There was a requirement that students who were boarding students at the school had to go to church on Sunday morning and chapel on Sunday evening. And we were allowed to go to any church. We could, go to the same church every week or a different church every week. And I was someone who I think had a spiritual life, but I was not a participant or a believer in any formal religion. And I had some fairly extended discussions with the headmistress of the school about why we were required to go to church. And I said I thought it was, perhaps somewhat hypocritical to make us attend church if we didn't believe. And she said she thought it would do us good to sit quietly and just reflect. So I would sometimes go to the Friends meeting in Cambridge and sometimes the Catholic church down the street. And the year after I left the school, they eliminated the church requirement.
Victory there. So then, when you were in college, I'm not surprised over the anti-Vietnam, but you were influenced by somebody very, very important, John Rawls. Can you tell them a little bit about that?
Yes, I think I mentioned that I was a philosophy and government major, and my real interest was in ethics and political theory and justice. And some of you, or many of you, may know that John Rawls was a really significant figure in 20th century philosophy. He was, at the time, chair of the philosophy department there, and he was just finishing a book which has really been considered a seminal work called Justice, A Theory of Justice. And I somehow got it into my head that I would like him to be my thesis advisor in my senior year. And one had to go talk to the senior tutor, one of the professors in the department, to get, sort of a selection of a thesis advisor. And I went to speak to Professor Nozick, and he said, "Who would you like to have as your thesis advisor?" And I said, "Well, I'd really like to work with Professor Rawls." And he said, "What are you wanting to write about?" And I said, "I wanted to write my thesis about Nietzsche." And he said, "Well, Rawls will tell you he doesn't know anything about Nietzsche." And he said, "But it isn't true." So I went to talk to Professor Rawls, and I said I would like him to be my thesis advisor. And he asked me what I wanted to write about, and I said Nietzsche. And he said, "I don't know anything about Nietzsche." Now, he had been the research assistant at Princeton for the leading translator of Nietzsche's work in the United States. So this gives you some sense of the, and he wasn't being pretentious. He really meant, "I don't really know anything about Nietzsche." And I said, "Well, Professor Nozick told me that you would say that, but he told me it wasn't true." And then you know what he said? He said, "I'll have to speak to Bob about that." He said, "We could try." He was a real great example, and I didn't take nearly as good advantage of him as a thesis advisor because I thought I can't go talk to him until I really know what I'm talking about. But he was a wonderful inspiration.
So then, after college, you worked at the Sanctuary. Tell us about the Sanctuary and where it was and what you did.
The Sanctuary was a small nonprofit organization that had been founded a year or two before that by two students at the Harvard Divinity School. And it had a drop-in counseling center for street youth and an overnight hostel for street young people, and an educational staff that did some drug education sessions for teachers and social workers, and a research staff. And one of my college classmates and I were hired on the research staff, and we got to work in September, and they said to us, "What would you like to do?" And we went, "Well, let us think about it a little bit." And we came back a day or two later and said, "We'd like to write a book about runaway teenagers." And they said, "Okay." So we spent the next year interviewing about 75 runaway teenagers and a number of parents, teachers, social workers, juvenile court judges, lawyers, probation officers, and others who had somehow touched on the lives of these runaways. And we wrote a book called Got Me on the Run, which was published at the end of the year.
Yes, I've ordered the book. I ordered it more than a month ago. I would hope to have it here so she could autograph it, number one, and that you could all see it. But Amazon said it's going to take them some time to get it for me. In fact, I think on eBay there were two
I should have brought you one.
two used versions. I wanted a brand new one if they could get me one. So it should be very interesting. That too has influenced you immensely.
It has. It has. Those young people that we interviewed influenced me immensely. They taught me. It was that experience really that made me decide to go to law school. This was very shortly after the United States Supreme Court had decided, one of the first cases that recognized that young people in the juvenile justice system have constitutional rights of due process and were entitled to be represented by lawyers in juvenile court proceedings. And we visited some juvenile courts, and we were not excessively impressed with the level of due process that was provided in these proceedings. And I just and visiting juvenile detention facilities and other settings where young people who had gotten crosswise with the law somehow were handled, I thought, somebody's got to make sure that the legal system is treating children better than this, and so I decided to go to law school.
So then she'd run away from New York City to Boston to go to a private girls' school for high school. Now she's really running away. She decides to go to the West Coast to learn law. So you went to law school at UC Berkeley, and you actually intended to be a lawyer for children at that time.
Yes, I did, and that was not a customary path for law students or lawyers. In fact, it was so recently that the U.S. Supreme Court had decided cases like the free speech case, Tinker versus Des Moines, and the In re Galt, the due process case, that when someone would ask, what do you want to do after law school, and I would say children's rights, and they would kind of wrinkle their brow and, kind of look puzzled, like, children's what? I mean, truly. And I had, parents of friends say to me, yes, but if you got offered a real job, you would take it, right? And, the career services people at the law school were encouraging me to interview with law firms and so on and so forth. And I just was very stubborn. I just decided that, I went to law school to do children's rights, and I am going to see what I can do to find a job doing children's rights. And so I was persistent, and my persistence was rewarded. But it took a while. It took me 11 months after I graduated from law school to find a job doing what I wanted to do.
What was your first job?
My first job was with an organization now called the National Center for Youth Law, then called the Youth Law Center. That was one of the only maybe 2 or 3 law reform children's rights offices in the country at the time.
And that was in San Francisco?
That was in San Francisco. Marianne Edelman had recently founded the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., and the ACLU had a children's rights project in New York City, and there was the Youth Law Center, and I think that was really it at the time. So I was very fortunate to be able to go to work there, and I started my time there working on issues related to the foster care system.